Hi, I'm Kiki Hodges, and I'm excited to work with the Adolescent Literacy Project again this year. I previously taught and worked with Dr. Salima Campbell at Kentucky State University, as well as I taught at Shelby County Public Schools. Prior to my stint of teaching in Kentucky, I taught high school in Iowa, and I presently teach middle school out in Washington State. So today I'm excited to be talking with you and working with you on different literacy pathways for digital learners. Much of this presentation will focus on mindful planning and using what we know about using the research we know about students and how they read online versus reading in print and their comprehension strategies, to use that for mindful planning in our classrooms. So you will need a note-taking device, whether you want to do that digitally or with print. You'll notice through this video platform that you'll have opportunities to add comments, questions, respond to other participants' comments, questions as well. So whatever you write will be public in terms of the participants here with ALP. So there are some certain pause points in the presentation, as well as specific sort of prompts in order to engage you in some of what we are thinking about and discussing in this presentation. You also need a physical text of any kind to sort of use as a reference point. It can be a summer read that you're doing. It could be a professional development book. It could be a manual you have nearby. So just some sort of print text will be needed for this presentation. So if you do have any questions or any follow-up comments or would like to know a little bit more, my personal email is down here at the bottom. It's also linked in the Google Classroom for the ALP Summer Institute. So our guiding questions for today's presentation are: what are your reading goals for your students? Whether those are tied to standards, whether they're tied to remediation or enrichment, but narrowing down some general reading goals that you have for your students. Another guiding question: how can home literacy be leveraged to support students? What have we learned coming out of the pandemic and how students function in their homes and what sorts of literacy opportunities they have available to them? And lastly, why is explicit strategy instruction important for digital learners? So we spend a lot of time talking about reading strategies for print text, but there are different strategies to use for reading online. So if you would, pause here and just jot down briefly in the annotations, what are your reading goals for your students? So these could be a broad few reading goals. And then what challenges do you face in helping students reach these goals? So these could be academic challenges, they could be personal challenges. What are the challenges that we face as teachers of literacy to our students? So a lot of the information that I'm pulling from today will come from the book How We Read Now by researcher Naomi Barron. I absolutely love her work, and I'm also a huge fan of Marianne Wolf, who wrote the foreword for the book as well. So this book was published in 2021, and it sort of compiles much of the research that she's been doing throughout her professional career. And some big key takeaways from this book are that research shows us that digital technology is not simply an alternative container for the same reading content, but rather a platform that can shape what and how students read. So the platform matters in our tasks of teaching literacy and how students are doing their reading. This is not my soapbox for saying print versus digital, one's better than the other. It is a both and discussion. So being mindful and considerate of what are our reading goals and what do we know about student success when they read online versus when they read print. And there's always exceptions, and there's always caveats. So students' prior knowledge, their individual preference for reading, and their motivation are all things that factor in whether or not they're successful when reading in print or reading online. Some of the other research that I'll be using comes from a Common Sense Media survey that it comes out every few years. So this one was published in 2021. I won't read through all the data on here. You can pause and read it at your leisure. But what the general findings are that even though media consumption was predictably higher during the pandemic, the usage of reading did not increase in frequency. So students are spending more time online, engaged in social media, engaged in YouTube, Netflix, whatever it is, but they're not reading any more frequently. So these are our students that we're talking about here. We're talking about teens and tweens. Some of you I know teach middle school, and some of you I know teach high school. So we also know that the digital divide continues to grow. So those with access to computers, and those who have greater access to computers typically come from higher income households. And this is significant because the types of platforms that you can read on for a computer vary from the types of platforms and applications used on a cell phone device. So when we're talking about the container for reading, this is where even reading on a phone versus a tablet versus a laptop has an impact on student navigation and student comprehension as they're reading. So again, this information is just to help us think about and be more mindful of when we are assigning text, when we are having students doing reading, considering who is reading on what type of platform and what types of strategies are needed that are different because of the container that they are reading from. So this survey came out in 2018. So I'm waiting for the next update from Scholastic's report, Kids and Family. It's the 7th edition. And all of these are linked in the slides as well. So you can look at the websites in more depth as well. So predictably, this is probably not new information or surprising or shocking in any way that more and more students are reading 0 books over the summer. And again, this information is to help us be mindful and think about what it is that we are doing to encourage book love. What are we doing to encourage reading outside, and how can we leverage home literacy to encourage reading pathways for all of our students. So if you would, pause here. There's again the annotation prompt. How do you feel about this information? So again, probably not new or shocking. For me, I'm a little bit of the number 3, the bear, overwhelmed by it and thinking about, out of all the things we have to consider when planning and running a classroom and engaging students, how does this all impact us? So go ahead and take a moment to add your thoughts or respond to other participants' thoughts in the platform, please. So again, going back to Barron's book, How We Read Now, what the research shows us is that digital technology is being used so much for entertainment and engaging in quick, short, and shallow interactions that this is impacting how our students read when they use digital platforms. Students typically, and you can survey your own students to find out what they think, but students often make the assumption that they can read faster and more accurately on screen than they can in print. This typically is not true. Students tend to read online materials more superficially than print. So knowing this about our students, we need to be mindful of the types of reading that we are assigning or that they're engaging in. And again, I am well aware that most districts have moved away from physical print books because of the cost. And so they see it as cost effective with all the digital access. And printing budgets are extremely tight. So trying to advocate what's best for our students can be a very difficult thing to do, but having print material options is really beneficial to our students. So when we're thinking about your reading goals for our students, we want to determine, okay, for particular unit, for assignment, even for that day, that lesson, what is the reading goal? And how can I align it with the available mediums? So if I'm using video, audio, digital text, or in combination, I need to make sure that they're actively engaged. I know there are a million different platforms and tools to use to engage students, but we have to also be mindful of how much cognitive load there is in having to click through applications and scroll. This adds a heavier cognitive load, especially for students who have less working memory than other students. So it can be more challenging to navigate these platforms. It's not that they're not understanding the reading, it's the navigation of the platform itself. And when we're having English language learner students use multimedia platforms, remember that adding audio input as well as reading text input adds extra cognitive load for our English language learners because it's two different types of processing they're having to do. Their understanding of spoken English may be faster than their grasp of reading it. And so having it in conjunction can actually be more difficult for them to comprehend than focusing on one type of input at a time. So the other thing that we need to consider are how can students achieve reading goals that also benefit their home literacy skills? So what is it they have at home that could benefit them when they're doing their reading? So when we're talking about reading and the reader, there are significant differences between print and digital. In print, we have a physicality, a sense of touch, distinctness. So if you take your printed material that you have and notice the layout, notice if you are skimming through it, that typically our sense of memory is also related to that sense of touch. So remembering something at the top of a page on the left versus next to a picture, that physicality helps our working memory. In digital, when we have more paging, more scrolling versus paging, this is much more challenging. So those with short-term memory challenges are more negatively affected by scrolling than those with higher levels of working memory. So it takes more cognitive focus to scroll through text and click through links than it does to page through a physical text. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about our reading goals for our students. So again, if we're assessing our reading, are we really assessing the reading, or are we assessing how well students can work through a platform? Another piece of research, social media, again, this is all from How We Read Now by Naomi Barron. Social media, so several studies have found that heavy users of social media typically have lower comprehension scores when we're talking about formal standard comprehension assessments in schools. So there's also a correlation between heavy social media use and poor ability to evaluate online sites. So again, I know a lot is asked of us as teachers to not just teach our content and the skills and strategies to master that content, but we also are teaching them how to think critically. And so what research is having a tendency to show us is that digital platforms do not always lend itself to critical thinking skills, that deep level of comprehension that we need. There are plenty of digital benefits. So adapting the text display, adjusting visual crowding, especially for our dyslexic students, having the ability to do voice to text as well as text to speech for some of our students is, again, a huge benefit. There's also personal preference. Some students prefer to read online and annotate or take notes online. And again, motivation. But again, students typically overestimate their level of comprehension when reading digital texts. So making sure students are developing those metacognitive skills and understanding that they may need to take a little bit more time with digital text to evaluate their comprehension. So knowing what we do about the challenges with reading online versus reading in print, and knowing that our students typically gravitate to reading online rather than reading in print, how can we use their home literacy skills to support our students? So I have linked in the slides, and you can do this at your leisure, a brief survey. So this is a survey that I often adapt and give to my students to understand what sort of literacy skills they have at home that I can possibly use to leverage and help them be more successful in the classroom. So it gives you an idea of range of knowledge that your students also bring to the classroom, and knowing how you can best support them with intervention and as well as enrichment. So another way to leverage home literacy are by sending home periodic surveys to the adults or guardians in their lives, providing voice and choice in the types of activities or readings or assessments that students are engaging in. A huge one is partnering with local libraries. They're typically more than willing, COVID protocols aside, to come into classrooms or, if possible, hosting events outside of school to help encourage so students can see what the public libraries have to offer. If you can incorporate any guest speakers or community members to talk about different types of literacy skills needed in the workplace, that I have found in the past that tends to really speak to especially our high school students, and knowing, why does this stuff matter? Why do I need to be able to do this? So using it for college and career readiness is a huge plus in motivating students. Having literacy events, whatever that may look like for your school or for your district, but something that encourages interaction with the whole family and engagement. Again, this can be hard working with students' work schedules, community work schedules, but having options available to families is really crucial. I have some examples linked in the slides, and again, you can look at those at your leisure, about different districts throughout the United States that have different literacy events and how they tailor it to whole families to promote literacy at home. And again, there's a folder in the Google Classroom Home Literacy Connection with some other ideas for you to look at. So what this means for us as educators: how can we use home literacy to support our students? Try to establish a home and school literacy connection. The more that students see connection to their everyday life, the more motivated they are to engage in the activities, learning, the critical thinking. Advocate for literacy events that include parents, communities, and other stakeholders. What I've typically found is that elementary usually has there's more of an emphasis in different districts for elementary to have such events, but it's really important to do this at the middle school and high school level as well. And share what you know about medium choices and the impact on reading success to your administrators, to your instructional coaches, and knowing what the research shows us and what's best for students. That can be a very difficult and lonely fight, but it's an extremely important one. So in your personal note-taking device, you don't need to put this in the annotations. You can if you would like, but jot down any ideas, questions you have about what I've presented on, how you can tie this into your everyday classroom planning, or your cross-content meetings if you're able to have those with others in your PLCs, and summarize your understanding so far. So now we'll get to some of the practical uses of this research and this information. So our last guiding question: why is explicit strategy instruction important for digital learners? So why do we need to teach explicit reading strategies for online reading? Well, again, what the research is showing us is that without explicit instruction, modeling, and practice, the chances of students taking notes, identifying keywords, or summarizing while listening to audio, watching video, or reading our text are lower than when reading a physical text. So this explicit instruction, modeling, and practice is essential for students to critically think and deeply read and understand the content and practice these skills. So that way they become automatic in the same way that hopefully annotating in print has become automatic for them by the time they finish high school. Digital technology is well suited for finding information. It's great for having a purpose preset and going and looking for that information, but it doesn't typically encourage contemplation and thorough evaluation simply because of the container that's presenting the information. So some explicit strategies to teach, model, and practice. One way to approach these strategies is by constantly thinking about before reading strategies, during reading strategies, and after reading strategies. What can you help students do to build their skills so they are doing these things automatically before, during, and after their reading? I typically in my classroom will spend different units focusing on different strategies and modeling them for the students, having them practice. And so that way they come up with their own toolkit of what works for them when they're reading online. So go ahead and pause here. And there's again another annotation to think about what strategies do you explicitly teach and model and what has worked for you. So this could be a good space for you to share what has worked for you or what's a challenge for you, and to get feedback from other participants as well. So our key takeaways from today. We should care about whether the reading makes a difference in their thinking and not just in their grade. So using mediums and platforms that will promote the critical thinking skills needed for life beyond school. Different reading goals require different levels of mental focus. So what is it that we're really truly asking students to do with the reading, whether it's print or online, and helping students understand and target what type of reading style they need to approach the text with. Incorporating home literacy helps leverage student strengths and provide voice and choice, and it helps you understand what type of platform they're reading on. So thinking about, if I assign something in a Google Classroom, how many clicks is it going to take them to actually get to the reading? Do they access it through their email? Do they access it through Google Classroom Stream? Do they access it through the headings in Google Classroom under classwork? If I'm using Canvas, are they accessing it through the announcements, or are they accessing it through the titles on the left-hand side? So it's really important to think about all the different ways and methods that students access the information. And if you have particular students who are struggling with reading, spend some time watching them work through accessing the material. This will give you really good insight into whether their issue is with finding the information or is it an issue with actually reading the text online. So is it their access points? They don't know how to organize the information, access the information, and annotate the information. So the default setting of a digital reading mindset tends to be shallower than a traditional print reading mindset. Because so much of their time spent doing digital reading is for entertainment, that mindset, those cognitive patterns have already developed. So when they approach reading online, they approach it the same way as they do navigating typically social media, Netflix, YouTube, whatever it is. So it does take a lot of metacognition to change that reading mindset for slowing down and doing deep reading when reading online. Another key takeaway is to make time in your curriculum for reading long texts. This is extremely challenging. I have challenges with it in my classroom as well, is getting students to take the time to read and read in depth. This is something that I work on all year long, is building student stamina for reading. And it's something that literacy teachers can't do on their own. It has to involve other content areas. And this is a bigger sort of discussion at the your school or district level as well. So some final advice, again from Naomi Barron's book, is ask yourself and your students, what do you know when the internet is down? What can you do? What can you explain? What could you teach? What could you show if you didn't have access to the internet? One of my favorite quotes from her book, read more, focus when you do, and just know that the medium does matter when you're reading. Some great resources that I use in my classroom as well. The researchers that I mentioned, Marianne Wolf and Naomi Barron, are very prolific. So they have lots of online articles, but they've also published lots of books as well. Reader Come Home is a more scientific approach to it. It's not as narrative of a text to read, but it explains a lot about dyslexia as well, and the reading brain and for a digital world. What we talk about when we talk about books, another great text on, as it says, the history and future of reading. Content area reading is a great one to use when you're trying to do some cross collaboration and using strategies that work for online and for print. Unpacking fake news, again, something that is essential in all of our classrooms. And then How We Read Now is a much more accessible approach to what research shows us about learning online and reading online and reading in print. Some other digital resources posted in the slides include the platform that I used here, the Video Ant for the annotations. Again, there's thousands of platforms, but again, what we want to focus on is what's the purpose and what's the goal with the platform. And then one that I enjoyed doing is the Kellogg's Feeding Reading Program. If you can collect some of those receipts, then you can put in for at least 10 of the books on their reading list. So if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to email me. If you have any feedback on the presentation, I'd love to hear that as well. My personal email is listed there, or my school email is also listed. So thank you all, and